Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 183 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and over 300 partnering organizations from all over the world that came together last spring in the midst of the pandemic to provide an open space on a daily basis so that people from all over the world could come together in community through Zoom and share their experiences of what it's like going through this extraordinary challenge that is put almost the entire human race into some form of lockdown and engaging in physical distancing, acutely aware of our health, and to provide an opportunity for those of us working for a better world to confer as to how we can enhance our strategic effectiveness, to enable us to use the crisis of the pandemic as an opportunity to fashion a future that is more healthy, resilient, regenerative, and in alignment with natural systems and constraints. One of our practices, which I would like to invite you to join me in right now, is a practice of heart coherence. I invite you to settle into your body, take a few deep breaths, close your eyes, and for the next minute or so, listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're alive at this crucial moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I'm delighted to introduce a program honoring one of the giants of our time, Dr. Stan Grof. One of the wonderful aspects of doing Humanity Rising day by day, week by week, now month by month, is that we've been able to cover every conceivable issue that is challenging humanity at this time. Yesterday, for example, we started a 5-session series on public health, looking at the soft psychological, emotional underbelly, as it were, of the pandemic. that is afflicting countries all over the world with acute challenges in emotional, psychological, and mental illness. Today, we want to turn to a celebration. We're getting close to Valentine's, which is this Sunday. And we want to just share our love and deep respect for Stan in his 90th year on this precious planet Earth. We started last month, as you may know, with Michael Murphy and Jim Hickman and Rick Tarnas, old friends of Stan's that have known him since the 70s and 80s and beyond. And this month, we want to bring other old friends of Stan's into the conversation. Rupert Sheldrake is actually an old friend of mine from my Cambridge days back in the 1970s and 80s. He's a biologist. Many of you are familiar with his work. This year marks the 40th anniversary of his initial work, A New Science of Life, in which he brought into the scientific conversation a radically new idea that we live and exist in fields of intelligent information sharing that has memory, morphic resonance. And that established his reputation worldwide as a scientist of extraordinary insight. And he's since then delved into the worlds of the paranormal, written a number of books on how dogs know that their owners are coming home, and on the sense of being stared at, and continues to do research on cutting edge areas of scientific inquiry. And in fact, on March 2nd, we're having a live workshop with Rupert so he can go deeper into the frontiers that he's exploring in science. We also are very privileged to have Will Keepin with us today. He's a mathematical physicist and an environmental scientist who's been, like Rupert, on the cutting edge of research and inquiry. He's also very deeply immersed in comparative religion. And it was his insight that it was Western tradition and Western civilization in the repression of the feminine that had led so inexorably to the denigration of nature and the denigration of women, that he founded the Gender Equity and Reconciliation International organization that's been working on gender issues in a very, very innovative and profound way for many, many years. And he uses the holotropic breathwork that Stan and a number of colleagues developed at Esalen in the 1970s and 80s as part of his practice. So those are some of the friends who will be joining us. I would like to now welcome Susan Logias. And she, as you know, is a documentary filmmaker and director, award-winning. We're going to be having the premiere of her latest film, The Voyage of the Psychonaut. It's going to be premiering tomorrow. Susan will be telling you more about that. But Susan, I want to welcome you to commence our program.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I was so honored when you suggested this tribute to Stan, and that every month we will be offering a segment that reflects on the documentary project that Stan and I worked on together for over a 7-year period now almost. And we'll be showing clips from the documentary to introduce our guests as we go, because everyone pretty much that's participating in these monthly tributes is also featured in our documentary. They so generously gave of their time and wisdom to inform our project. So I'm very honored that they're joining us. And tomorrow at 10 a.m., there will be our streaming of the documentary. I think the link is being provided, The Way of the Document, the Way of the Psychonaut, sorry. And tomorrow, our guests will be joining us afterwards on a live panel, Stan and Brigitte Grof, as well as Dennis McKenna and Rick Doblin. And we will be asking them the question, how psychedelics changed their lives. Because it certainly changed my life and opened my mind to seeing the world in a different way. So before we go any farther, I'd like to introduce Stan and his wife, Brigitte Grof. So hopefully there they are. So I'm going to let Stan say a few words and introduce his wife, Brigitte.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I thank you for we are meeting, regularly now with wonderful people, wonderful friends who I have seen for a very long time, many times in Estland, and then all these international ITA conferences. So it's a very, very moving situations where we're all coming together again. Mm. Now, before I say something, I would like to explain something that happened 2.5 years ago. I have a stroke, and I did not have any
paralyzed.
Yeah, yeah. It mostly hit my speech center. So I would like to introduce Brigitte. She's my wife. We have known each other now over 35 years, and we got married now about will be five years ago. She came to SLN for the first time when we met, at a time when we are not making formal training at the time. So she was the first one who was really teaching and learning in holotropic breathwork. And now after this years when we create a reunion, we have been all over the world. We have been in South America. We have been in Czech Republic. We have been in Scandinavian countries. We have been in Paris and so on. So it's wonderful for me to be here. When I cannot get some of the word. She knows basically everything I know, so she would help. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan. I'm so glad that you're here with us. So what we're going to jump now to a clip from the documentary that will introduce Rupert Sheldrake. And I don't think I need to introduce the clip because it's basically setting us up for how this conversation will proceed.
One second, Susan.
Oh, sorry.
Slight problem. I'll be right there. Hold on.
Okay, well then. So as we're waiting for this clip, I'll just say how wonderful it's been to work with Stan for these last 7 years, how much I've learned from him, and how impressed I am by the respect that so many people hold for him, how his contributions have impacted so many lives. And it was really the thinking of our theme today is Stan's impact on visionary thinkers, and how their interactions with Stan added to their perspectives, changed their direction, informed their work. And our question today is, how have they evolved since that interaction? Where are they now?
Okay.
Stan Grof wrote me a long handwritten letter saying how much he liked my book. He'd had a copy shipped. And he invited me to speak at a conference he was organizing in Bombay. But I'd never been to California. I'd never heard of things like the New Age movement. I'd never heard of Stan Grof. I'd never heard of Esalen. And suddenly in this hotel was a kind of astonishing world of people who are into consciousness research, talking about the Esalen Institute. Stan was talking about his psychotropic breathing and LSD research and so on. I was amazed to find myself in an environment where I could talk about the things I was really most interested in, where people were interested in finding out more, a kind of fizz of excitement and discovery and new horizons.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Brigitte. Now, Rupert, please join us. I believe Rupert's coming in from London, and will share his experiences with Stan and how that impacted his scientific research. Rupert?
Well, first, I'm very pleased to be here with you, and it's wonderful to be with Stan too, as he approaches his 90th birthday. That conference in Bombay that I referred to in that recorded session was enormously important for me. It was opened up a whole new world. Before that, I'd been living in India for 5 years, working in an agricultural research institute, then living in the ashram of Father Bede Griffiths. And before that, I'd been in Cambridge. And so it was an unfamiliar world. And one thing I didn't mention in that short clip was one of the most important things that happened at the conference is I met my now wife, Jill Peirce. So we have 2 sons, Merlin, who's written a wonderful book on fungi, and Cosmo, who's a musician. And none of that would have happened probably if it hadn't been for Stan. So he's had the most immediate and enormous impact on my life. When he invited me to Esalen to take part in his month-long program, I think that was in 1982. The conference was in February 82 in Bombay. Again, I found a whole new world opening, and the Stan's work there I learned more about, and his visionary research in psychedelics and the further reaches of the mind. I also, through being at Esalen, met people who invited me to the Ojai Foundation, which was then a very creative center, and where I took part in a number of programs over the years. I continued to do programs at Esalen. And I suppose one of the most important contacts that came out of that first year was my meeting with Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham. We met at Terence's house in Sonoma County in Northern California. And we started a friendship which went on until Terence died in the year 2000. Every year we met and we had 3-way conversations, trialogues. Some of them were published in books. The first book was called Trialogues at the Edge of the West, now retitled Chaos, Creativity, and Cosmic Consciousness. And most of those happened at Esalen. That's the edge of the West was both literal as well as metaphorical. The second book's called The Evolutionary Mind. And these trialogues are all online in audio and video formats, so dozens of them. And they still have a lot of people listening to them. Terence McKenna lives on beyond the grave as an inspiration to thousands and thousands of people. So the influence of that first meeting and Stan's introduction of me to a whole range of new people and to the Esalen Institute was enormously important. Since then, I've been doing research on morphic resonance, continuing the discussions of it and experimental investigation of it. As Jim mentioned, I've done research on psychic phenomena, telepathy in dogs and in people, particularly in relation to dogs knowing when their owners are coming home, other unexplained powers of animals, telephone telepathy, which is a very important field of research at the moment. the sense of being stared at. And more recently, I've been exploring the areas between science and spirituality, partly because I'm a scientist, I'm interested in spiritual practices. My most recent book is Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. 7 different spiritual practices. One of them is called Spiritual Openings Through Cannabis and Psychedelics. And one of the points I make there is that for many people in the modern world, psychedelic experiences are a kind of rite of passage, an opening of the spiritual realm. And they were for me when I first took LSD in 1970. I was, at that stage, I was working in the Department of Biochemistry at Cambridge University. Nothing in my education had prepared me for this. And I had this extraordinarily transformative experience on my very first experience with LSD. It wasn't until years later that I read some of Stan's work on LSD research and realized that this experience I'd had was a kind of near-death type experience of as if being drowned and compressed and then escaping by coming up to the surface, emerging into the light where everything was transformed, joyful, blissful, beautiful. And I wouldn't really have been able to put that into a framework without that wonderful pioneering work that Stan did. And of course, Stan's pioneering work on psychedelics is now the basis of a whole new psychedelic renaissance. The amount of studies going on is increasing year by year. After years of being closed down, the value of these experiences both in opening people's minds and also in treating intractable problems like persistent depression and addictions is becoming clearer and clearer. And it's wonderful that Stan has lived to see this, because he helped open the gates to what I think is a whole new phase of consciousness research. I think we're very fortunate that it's happening. And of course, the Esalen Institute was the epicenter of thinking about this for many years, possibly one of the only centers in the world where these subjects could be discussed. So I just feel immensely grateful for the doors that Stan has opened for me personally and for all of us collectively.
Thank you, Rupert. I would like to invite you to turn on your video and join in the conversation. Rupert, tell us a little bit more about your own experience in going to Esalen and your first interactions with Stan.
Well, I first interacted with Stan at the transpersonal conference itself in Bombay, but I wasn't there for very long. I was harvesting my chickpea crop at the time. And when Stan first invited me, I said I couldn't go because it was the busiest time of year at my institute near Hyderabad. And then finally we had a compromise where I took the night train from Hyderabad to Bombay, and I was really only there for about 36 hours. Then I had to get back to the harvest because it was the peak harvest season. So I didn't see much of Stan there, but when I was at Esalen, I came to know him more and see more of him through his month-long program, which was a truly visionary assembly of people. And Stan managed to be there looking so solid, so grounded, amidst what could easily have been, floated off into the wildest realms of speculation or visionary fantasy. Stan somehow enabled all that to happen, but to keep it grounded. And his very presence was grounding. Whenever he was in the room, I felt everything was more grounded. I also took part in some holotropic breathwork sessions, which I found very helpful and enlightening. And, I had some remarkable insights through them. but the thing about Stanley was that he, at that and at subsequent transpersonal conferences, which I went to, including that very famous one in Prague, which was the first one after the fall of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, that he somehow always managed to keep these things grounded, open, always open, but somehow just keeping it grounded. And I think that's what he's done for this whole movement and in my own life too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Stan, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you so much for everything you have created, you have contributed. For us, it was really important when we started creating the holotropic psychology, you know. We knew, you know, that there was a lot to it. But we cannot, initially we cannot, how we could connect the transpersonal psychology with what we call science, you know, what we were taught in universities and so on. And you were one of the important people who suddenly showed that there is a possibility of being scientists and at the same time being interested in transpersonal psychology. And you know, all the contributions that you brought to the month-longs and of course to the ITA conferences is amazing.
Yeah, I think it would be
I wish
worth,
I could express it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Stan.
Anyway.
We're doing fine.
Well, thanks, Stan. I think that what you see, one of the things about morphic resonance is collective memory. I mean, this is a natural feature. Basically, it's saying that every species has a kind of collective memory. And so the way that you saw how it tied in with Jungian ideas and with the kinds of experiences people were having through the holotropic breathwork and also through the experience of archetypes like the birth archetype, and through these archetypes coming through psychedelic experiences as well, was enormously important because for me, it was a kind of affirmation that helped see that this really did connect with experience. I first came to the idea of morphic resonance through working on plant development. I'm a botanist, basically. I mean, that was how I started out. I've always been interested in animals, but I did research on plants because I didn't want to have a whole career in research killing animals. If you do research on animals in modern science, the first thing you do in most branches of science is to kill them. I didn't feel quite so bad about plants, and actually most of the research I'd done was with living plants, as in my agricultural research. Anyway, given this botanical and chemical background for my thinking, it was enormously important for me to connect with an area that before the transpersonal conference and so on, I didn't know very much about, you know, psychology, Jungian psychology, these other realms of the mind. And so you helped to open up this whole area for me. And in my second book, The Presence of the Past, there's much more about cultural inheritance and collective memory and the connections with Jung. Excuse me. So this was a very important ingredient for me as well, a kind of cross-fertilization.
I wonder if Will has anything he'd like to offer.
Well, first of all, this is just such a privilege to join you all. And Rupert, thank you for your reflections on Stan. I'll share mine in a moment, but I see so many parallels there with the awakening and the groundedness and Stan is a true scientist, of which there are sadly only a small number, as Einstein once said. If you take out of the temple of science all of those who have an ego agenda or an economic agenda or whatever else it is, you're left with very small percentage. And so I'm very grateful to be among some true scientists today. And so before I touch on Stan, I just want to say, Rupert, what you have done, your work has been so important and inspiring not only with the scientific research you've done on these remarkable phenomena, but also you're challenging directly the hegemony, the epistemological, really blind spots of the whole materialist foundation of science. And in your books, The Science Delusion, which I think was Science Set Free in the United States, and going through those metaphysical assumptions of science and showing that every one of them is actually contradicted by the available evidence. So here what we have, and this is really a systemic problem in science to this day, we have the orthodoxy of science violating the very principles it claims to cherish in the name of upholding them. So it's a very profound and bizarre crisis that continues today as it has for a long time. And Stan, so to speak to Stan, I met Stan in 1987. And I was at a crisis point in a certain sense in my life because I had just come through a whole whistleblowing experience with the nuclear industry, which I'll say more about maybe later. And I had also met some of the great scientists. I was in a debate with Hans Bethe, the Nobel laureate, in physics, who had discovered thermonuclear fusion. And I was quite disillusioned by some of his blind spots that he would not see, even though he was such a beautiful man and had been such a pioneer for stopping the arms race. He was one of the very few sort of founding fathers of the nuclear era that was really directly and actively opposing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So I was very drawn to him and very disappointed in this debate that I had. So I was in this whole crisis with my own scientific destiny and future, because that was my training. And when I met Stan, it was a time when I was reading everything I could find on transpersonal psychology in the mid-'80s. And so I went out to a conference in Asilomar, a weekend conference that Stan was doing in 1987. And actually, I had already experienced the breathwork in a program that Barbara Finn Dyson led. And I was just blown away by the power of the breathwork. And so I had to meet Stan Grof as I read his books. The other thing I want to say is that I also had that awakening through psychedelics that so many of us did in the 60s. And I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they invented nuclear weapons. And so, taking LSD up in the hills outside of Los Alamos, in late high school and college, and waking up to what our town was really all about was astounding. And the stark reality that our town's industry was basically developing the means to incinerate a whole city of 5 or 10 million people in an instant. And that's our, hometown business. It was very shocking. And no one ever seemed to speak to it starkly like that. But how psychedelics can remove the veils, and sometimes you look into some pretty dark truths directly. So that was a big wake up for me. And so actually, as an aside, I'll just mention Krishnamurti went and visited Los Alamos. I don't know if you know that, but you can find a video online. And he was very gracious. He was teaching them meditation and all these things. And at one point they asked him directly, if you were director of this laboratory, what would you do? And he said, I would never be director of this laboratory. He said, now I know that you do a few good things, there's some solar research and stuff, but he said the majority of what you're doing, you are giving your lives to destruction. And in the process, you are destroying every single human being. That was amazing. So he gave the spiritual transmission, the truth that no one ever spoke. But throughout my childhood, every couple of years, there would be some scientist who would commit suicide and leave some note. I just can't do this anymore. I just can't be part of it. But no one could speak about it. So I grew up in that whole contradiction, And so the psychedelic awakening, I remember one that was very powerful was my ecological awakening. I had a friend who had gotten some really high quality peyote from the Native Americans who lived in the Grand Canyon, because this person worked in the Grand Canyon River tours. And so we took that and we were hiking across the Valle Grande caldera, which is an extinct volcano near Los Alamos. Beautiful day hike. We hiked all the way across this caldera. And as we were coming to the other side, I started to feel awful. We had one of those ecstatic days, you know, hugging trees and bonding with all of the beautiful nature out there, laughing, and very deep, ecstatic, joyful day. And suddenly I started to feel awful and I didn't know why. And so I got quiet and I started thinking I'm starting to lose it. You know, it's going into a bad trip sort of fear. And I was with two friends and they also became quiet. And finally, one of us said, I'm not feeling good. And suddenly we all three realized that none of us were feeling good. We were all feeling this same feeling of dread. And we didn't even understand it, but we realized that it was getting stronger and stronger the closer we got to this hilltop. And so we realized something is going on over on the other side of that hill. And and we thought about, well, we don't want to check it out. It's like, whatever it is, it's not good. But then we thought we have to, you know, kind of like a little detective story or something. So anyway, as we approached the hill, it got more intense and more intense. And when we crested the hill, what we saw, we just burst into tears. It was a clear cut, an absolute clear cut. And of course, I'd seen these before, but with that perceptual sensitivity, it looked like a battlefield with fallen beings all over the place, cut up into pieces. And the carnage was everywhere. And we all just burst into tears and went around these trees that we had been loving all day. And you could feel the violence of it and the unconsciousness of the violence, that those who had come in and raped the earth in this place had no awareness of what they were doing, just came in with the saws and took everything down, and there were pieces and limbs and trunks lying around. So that was a major awakening for me of the pain of the earth in the face of Western civilization. And it was undeniable, unmistakable. And as Thich Nhat Hanh said some years later in an environmental retreat, because I became an environmental scientist, he said, what we most need to do is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. Because when that happens, we wake up to the fact that the earth is a living being and we have a relationship with the earth that has been severed in certain significant ways by our scientific paradigm, by the objectivist, materialist, reductionist paradigm that is basically, I dare say, ontologically incorrect, even if it has produced a number of valuable insights. So coming back to Stan, part of the reason I wanted to study with Stan was because I'd had these kind of spiritual and mystical experiences with psychedelics, but I knew this is more profound than just something to party on, but I had no concept of who knows about these things and what's really going on. And so when I found Stan's books, it was clear that this man has approached this all from a scientific perspective and really knows what it's all about. So I went to California in 1987. I did a weekend workshop, and Stan announced that they were going to do this training the following year. And I was like, I'm on that. So I joined the first training that he did after Esalen, because he was doing the month-longs at Esalen, and then he started the early Grof transpersonal training. And so I joined that. And then I had this whole revelation of Stan's work, Stan's vision. And I want to say, as a scientist, and this is really important because so many scientists get lost in the current paradigm and never think beyond it or outside of it. And it's not a criticism of them, but the true scientist follows wherever the data lead and basically allows the data to be the primary evidence that one then works with. And this is what Stan did with the psychedelic data, with his work in Prague initially, when he was working with psychedelics in the mental hospital, and then in Maryland, and then at Esalen. And what he did was he charted out, literally, the experiential phenomena that emerged in psychedelics and later in the holotropic breathwork, and developed what he called a cartography of the psyche. And that was such an appropriate term. No one understood these things. When people were taking LSD, people had different kinds of experiences, but why did the same person have different experiences with the same drug on different days? And why did different people in the same day have different experiences? What is going on here? And Stan laid it all out and basically looked at the entire broad data of psychedelic phenomena and non-ordinary states phenomena, and then organized them into categories and broad categories, which he called the biographical, the prenatal, or the perinatal, and the transpersonal. And then within those, there were subcategories. That's what a scientist does. A scientist basically looks at the fullness of the evidence, then organizes it, and begins to, first of all, just look at all that's there. And this is one of the great blind spots of today's science, is that we have the whole spiritual reality in addition to our physical reality. And we don't have a science of our spiritual reality that's recognized within our mainstream science. It's maybe now just beginning, as Rupert was saying so beautifully. Science and spirituality are finally beginning a very important dialogue. And of course, David Bohm was one of the pioneers in that arena, 40 years ago, developing his work. But this is still very, very new. And the whole realm of consciousness is still regarded in the mainstream as simply a side effect of the neurophysiology of the brain, an epiphenomenon, a minor and unimportant detail, that all of which can be explained by the material processes within the brain. Stan was one of the pioneers who really began to challenge that paradigm, in his book, Beyond the Brain, the whole idea that consciousness is not created inside the brain any more than the content of a television program is created inside the TV set. So these were some of the awakenings that Stan brought. And when I did the training, it was, I came at it as a scientist because a lot of the things Stan was saying, I could not, it's like, that's just too wild. That's too far out to believe, because my training was in pretty solid physics and mathematical physics and that whole pretty straight materialist paradigm. So Stan was, blowing my circuits, practically every other sentence in that training. And I was constantly asking for evidence and proof. And he kept giving it. Some of my fellow trainees were getting quite annoyed with all my questions. They called me aside at lunch and said, why don't you just let him talk? But I did check with Stan. He said, no, I like the questions, keep it coming. So, and I needed them because he was blowing my mind open. When you have got the formal training in mathematical physics, there is a whole kind of unconscious priesthood transmission that happens, which, if you spoke it out loud, says, we are the king of the heap. We have taken the power of the sun into our own hands with thermonuclear fusion. We are the latter-day Prometheus people. And we're the king of the heap of science. And the hydrogen bomb and nuclear power is the proof. And so we have the greatest power in the universe right in our own hands. That kind of power and conditioning, it's never spoken, but that's what happens. And I was in that. And I grew up in that in Los Alamos. So all of that was being blown away by this whole new vista that Stan was opening up. The whole science of consciousness, the whole interconnection, which quantum physics calls, quantum entanglement, which I think, by the way, is a complete misnomer. Not a tangle. It's not a jumbled mess. It should be quantum interbeing or quantum communion. It's a cosmic spiritual harmony where everything is intimately connected with everything else.
Will,
I'll stop there for right now.
Well, I'm going to think this might be a perfect moment to share the clip from the documentary where you describe the Mandelbrot set as an example of what you're talking about.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
One of the key insights from the new physics is that reality has something of a holographic structure or fractal structure. And the simplest example of this is a mathematical structure that we call the Mandelbrot set. Now in science, this is called nested sets of self-similar structures. But I like to think that this is actually a modern scientific discovery of an ancient hermetic principle of alchemy, as above, so below, as within, so without. That basically the microcosm replicates the macrocosm. If we apply these ideas to spirituality, what I would propose is that consciousness itself has this same fractal structure, which means that there is a self-similarity at all levels of existence.
Is that a good representation of what you were describing?
Yeah, that's a beautiful vignette, and I wasn't quite sure what you were going to show, so thank you. Excellent.
Well, and
And
I think
ahead,
too, I want to reach back to Rupert, the idea of morphic resonance, as you were saying, you were looking at this field of consciousness that in which plants, their evolution, sort of reaches beyond a local, it takes place in a non-local environment, and here we have it in human consciousness, and even in the creation of the universe, that it exists on every possible dimension of existence.
Yes, I think this is one of the great insights of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, that the reason we're able to understand nature, at least up to a point, is because our minds work the same way as the natural world, because they're part of the natural world. And the way our minds are able to recognize plants and forms of animals and all the things that we can recognize are because there are forms in our minds and there are forms in nature. And the way the forms are created in our minds and in nature, the way they're remembered, which I would say happens through morphic resonance, is similar in both cases. So there's a fundamental similarity between the working of our minds and the workings of the natural world, as opposed to the standard mechanistic materialist view, which says that on the one hand, our minds have this unique insight into nature, which is inanimate, unconscious, and purposeless. On the other hand, it also says our minds are nothing but epiphenomena of the activity of our brains. It's sort of self-contradictory right at the very heart of its paradigm. But it doesn't admit that our minds and the rest of nature work the same way. We have a kind of privileged knowledge because we can do maths, the kind of mindset Will was just referring to, the high priests of physics. Anyway, I think that the idea that there's a similarity both in nature and in our minds is a view that has ancient lineage. The medieval philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas thought like this. But Stan's done more than almost anyone to bring it to life again in the modern world as the relevance and the importance of this way of thinking.
Well, I'd like to suggest as well, and you can correct me if I'm way off, but a lot of the research is showing when they do an fMRI of the brain when someone is under the influence of a psychedelic, without this substance, there are regions of the brain and they kind of stay within their own communication network. There's a hierarchy of who gets to have the most influence and what information is assimilated. Under a psychedelic, under that experience, all these neural pathways open up and everything is available all at once. So if you consider, as you describe in the documentary, the field theory of the mind, if this mind is similar to all of existence, then when these pathways are opened up, we do have full access potentially to the reality of a plant or an animal or the consciousness of a stellar system or the universe. And so it's an opportunity to explore those things. And I know, Stan, in your book, When the Impossible Happens, you describe experiences of being with the plant, or even Dennis McKenna describes experiencing photosynthesis.
Stan, do you want to comment?
You want to say something?
You asked me at one point, I said that I had the experience of identified with dreams, sequoia, and that I could understand how auxins, create in this wine around the dreams and so on. And you were asking, you wanted me to explain you that you had some ideas about auxins. And
yes,
if I can sort of add to it, and of course I don't know, this is not my
Your
area, yeah. So I see how it happens, and I'm sure at this time you have already experienced this trees, identification with them, and there are some amazing by Dennis, of course. So,
well,
can you say what you experience now about the
well, the thing
trees,
is that
trees, or plants in general?
Well, when I was a research student at Cambridge, a graduate student, I was working on the production of the hormone auxin, which is the main hormone that gives growth and creates new roots, new wood, extension of stems. It's the most important of the plant hormones. And what I discovered at Cambridge, and I had just had I was under a tree, I was walking under a tree, and I suddenly had this moment of vision. I realized that the auxin was produced by dying cells, that when a cell dies, the proteins break down. And when the proteins break down, all the breakdown products of the amino acids appear. The proteins are hydrolyzed, releasing all 20 different amino acids. Those amino acids then break down, and the amino acid tryptophan breaks down to give a range of breakdown products. One of them is indole acetic acid, or auxin. Auxin is a tryptophan breakdown product. Plants also produce, as the cells die, tryptamine and 5-hydroxytryptamine. The interesting thing is that in animals, breakdown products of dying cells like histamine and tryptamine have become key hormonal and neurotransmitters and derivatives of them. Whereas in plants, the one that's become the key factor is auxin, indole acetic acid, breaking from tryptophan. Well, I published this research in 1973 in the Biological Reviews. And it wasn't very successful in the botanical world, because at that time, everyone thought auxin must be made by a regular biosynthetic pathway, couldn't be made by dying cells, it's too random. And at that stage, programmed cell death wasn't a fashionable topic. Now it is. Anyway, there's been a great deal of research since then. And the interesting thing is that during this COVID lockdown, I went back to my original auxin work. I looked at all the recent research. I've read hundreds of papers that have come out since, and their attempts to explain it in terms of regular biosynthetic pathways have just run into the ground again and again. So I wrote to the editor of the Journal of Experimental Botany, one of the top journals in the field, asking if I could do a review of auxin production. And they said, yes, they'd like me to do that, which I did. And I recently heard that not only has my review been accepted, it's been promoted to the rank of a Darwin Review, which is their most prestigious review. They only have 4 a year. It's coming out next month. And so auxin is returning to the stage of plant sciences in a new way, because most plant scientists who've read my review, a few of them have read it pre-publication, most of them were completely unfamiliar with this idea. And because it explains the facts so very well, much better than the conventional view, they're wildly enthusiastic. And so, interestingly, this vision that happened a long time ago, I mean, maybe 1966 or something, of dying cells releasing that which causes new growth, and death and life. Death occurs within life, and the death within life triggers out more life. And I also worked out how auxin evolved in mosses and liverworts, which are the first plants on land. auxin is not an internal hormone to start with. It's a signal of cell death. It stimulates the production of rhizoids, little hairs that absorb moisture and nutrients. And what happens whenever they're in the presence of decaying matter, organic matter, and of course they're growing close to the surface, the humus of the soil and rotting logs and things, whenever they encounter an area where there's a lot of rotting going on, that rotting produces auxin as a breakdown product. So it started as a signal of external decay, and then it became internalized within plants when cell death became part of cell growth, plant growth. And of course, xylem cells, wood cells, are dead cells. They're empty tubes that conduct water. And to become empty tubes, they have to differentiate and die. So this whole story, which we talked about years ago, and you had this vision of things in trees, has taken on a whole new lease of life. And I wouldn't be at all surprised that if there's a major discussion of this starting next month, as my son Merlin, who's a plant scientist, said, to have a Darwin review in the Journal of Experimental Botany makes this paper almost unavoidable. And so it's interesting you should bring that up, because this is one of the things that's been happening in my life recently, a kind of reconnection with some of my earlier work before I got onto morphic resonance and all that sort of thing.
If you have some paper, I would love to look at it, you know, because it's
I'll send it to you. Yes.
Something that I brought up. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
You know, Will, I know you have a great understanding of archetypal astrology, but from what I'm learning, there are moments in a period of creativity where it may be decades that pass before the work comes out to the world. Can you speak about that a little bit? I know we're sort of jumping topics here, but it seems to be that way with Jung's work with the Red Book, when he created it, when it was finally published.
Sure. Well, let me say that this whole arena of astrology or archetypal psychology or archetypal cosmology is actually really an application of this inherent oneness of the entire cosmos, which all the spiritual traditions teach. And so that oneness is manifest as connections between the physical universe and the consciousness cosmos. And this is where science is really still really at a very significant blind spot. Just very briefly, for example, the holographic principle, which I find very fascinating, and I'm really excited that it's happening within physics, because basically it's the principle that there is the entire universe as we know it is actually a projection of hyperspace. And the way it's mathematically formulated, that hyperspace is a two-dimensional plane, really, of information. It functions very much like a photographic plate in a holographic photographic plate, where you shine laser light on it and you get a three-dimensional image just suspended there in midair, sort of thing. And the idea of the holographic principle is that that's the nature of the universe. Now, I find it more interesting for the direction it's moving than for the actual content, because what it's saying is that the physical universe hangs and depends on a larger, invisible, informational universe. That's a metaphor for what the spiritual traditions teach across the traditions, which is that the physical universe is a manifestation of something larger, which is a consciousness universe. And it has this holographic structure, which means that the part contains the whole. And where I feel the possible meeting of science and spirituality is on either side of that two-dimensional hyperspace, because it's a plane, and a plane has two sides. On this side, on the physical side, there is a projection which creates the physical universe. On the other side, one could say there is a similar holographic spiritual universe. And in my work, applying these principles of holography and fractals in the domain of consciousness and mysticism has been very rich. And I'll just mention, this is my book on this, called A Belonging to God, Spirituality, Science, and a Universal Path of Divine Love. And what I show in there is, for example, we can understand these teachings from the mystics across the ages, who are basically saying the infinity of divinity is experienced through the gateway of the heart. that the heart is an organ of spiritual perception. And as Meister Eckhart says, for example, when the heart is purified, God pours all of God's divinity, all of God's beauty, all of God's infinity into that heart. So the heart is actually bigger than the universe. As Rumi says so beautifully, the secret turning in your heart is the entire cosmos turning. This is the fractal structure of consciousness, or holographic structure of consciousness, which mirrors the holographic structure of physical reality. So I think there's a very profound correspondence there. And I want to say, Stan had his work in holotropic breathwork provides an experiential methodology to realize this. That's available, it's cheap, and it's legal. And I want to just give a couple of examples, because to honor Stan, if I may, because I have spent since 1987, I've been applying holotropic breathwork in lots of different arenas, particularly with environmental scientists and in the gender equity and reconciliation work we do. And I just have to give a couple of examples because this is such a tribute to Stan's work. People sometimes think holotropic breathwork is primarily a kind of psychological healing modality, and it is par excellence. I applied it with my colleagues, Sharon Farrow and Bonnie Morrison in Atlanta. We all did the training with Stan together. And for 6 years, we applied breathwork in their psychotherapeutic practice, working with clients healing from sexual trauma and violation. That was a major opening to me about the power of this work for healing. But it goes beyond that. So when I was organizing spiritual retreats for environmentalists for many years, and they would come in and they would almost always resist. I remember one of them said, "What are we doing here? 3 days, we have 3 days and we have a half-page agenda. Usually we have 3 hours and a 3-page agenda. So half a day and a 3-page agenda. What are we wasting our time here? And what is this thing on the second day? Breath work the entire day?" So, that was the kind of attitude I was up against. And one of them was this young scientist. He worked for the Nature Conservancy, 30-something, brilliant. And what he was doing, he was tracking the elk habitats west in the western part of Colorado, and right there and west of Boulder, where the mountains meet the plains. And what was happening there was that there were all of these, expansion of people building their 40-acre ranchettes. There were 3,000 driveways that had been carved into that thing, and they had plans for 6,000 more. And what was happening was the elk had nowhere to go. Everywhere they were in someone's backyard. And so he was tracking what was happening to the elk and the elk habitats as a function of this development. And he would spend, literally 10, 15 days out with his backpack camping, tracking, following the elk with his camera, his binoculars, his scientific note-taking. So he was one of the people at this workshop who was resistant to this breath work. Well, during the breath work, he was breathing along, doing his thing, the music's going, and he had a whole thing around his father that he went through in the early part. And then at one point, sort of 2/3 of the way through the session, suddenly this guy exploded. And those of you who've done breath work, you know how that can happen. So we're facilitating, we're all rushing in with pillows to try to contain this, don't know what's happening, but it was big. I knew that. And he was all over the place. And afterwards, when I came in to check with him, what happened and how was your session, and what should we do at the end? And he looked at me and his eyes were on fire and kind of half terror, but mostly exhilaration. And he said, "I became an elk." And he said, "My hands became hoofs and the elk herd invited me for a gallop." So this man who had been studying elk and basically merging with them in a certain sense, and we helped him to understand you didn't just become an elk, the elk family invited you in because they realized you were one of that 7 billion species that's kind of destroying everything, who actually cares about them. And so they invited you in for a gallop. So he had a full shamanic shape-shifting experience into becoming an elk. I tell you, that blew his scientific circuits, for good. And every year after that, every time we came, he was the strongest advocate for doing this breath work that we had. So that's one example of how the breath work in one single experience kind of completely transformed this man's worldview and also connected him to elk at a level he had never gotten to with his scientific notes and observations. So that's one example. And the other example, do I have time for one more story?
Sure.
The Indian from India.
Oh, you want to hear that one? It's really one of the most.
Can you do it short? Can you
Sure,
do
I
it
can
short?
do it short.
But it's the most powerful holotropic
it's one of the most
story,
amazing
that
stories.
I've never seen like that, and Brigitte has not.
Yeah. So basically, we were doing breath work as part of our training in gender equity and reconciliation, and so we had a few people from India. We had these two young men that were just terrific, and they're part of our community there that we work with, Mahir, it's called, outside of Pune, India. And so, and both Cynthia and I, Cynthia's my colleague and wife, and we thought, they're gonna love breath work. This is so perfect, because they were just open to everything. And they lay down, and sure enough, one of them did. He was just all over the map, and just, you could tell he was just rocking out and enjoying it, and had a beautiful, kind of normal, if you will, sort of, well, there's no normal, but very good intro experience. And the other one, within 15, 20 minutes, began to writhe and move and was just in agony. And I ended up working with him for most of the session, holding him, guiding him. You know, you're working energetically with the person. You don't know the content of what's happening, but energetically you merge with their energy and you support whatever's trying to emerge. You're sort of helping as a midwife would help to birth whatever's trying to come forward. That's kind of the basic philosophy of the facilitation. So as a facilitator, you're not causing anything. You're simply supporting what's already emerging. Anyway, afterwards, he told the most remarkable story of what happened. He went back to his birth experience. And he grew up in a small town, Muslim community in rural India. And they had a custom there. As you probably know, in India, sadly, boys are more valued than girls. And the boy to girl ratio is sometimes, as low as, 850 to 1,000 in certain regions of India because of female infanticide and the whole problems there. But so his father had two daughters, and he wanted a son. So there was a tradition, a superstition in that community, and I think in several of these backwater rural communities, where you pray to Allah, pray to God, and you ask for a son, but you make a deal with God, which is that if you get a baby boy, you throw the baby off of the mosque, which is 3 stories high, and some people down below with a mat try to catch the baby. And if the baby survives, then you get to keep it. It was like, okay, you get to have a son. But if the baby dies, then that son belonged to God. So the idea was that as the man, I'm praying for a son, God, but if you don't want me to have one, just bring one and we'll do this test. And then if it's truly your baby, the baby will die. And if I'm meant to have it, the baby will live. Can you imagine? And so this young man, he was about 24 at the time, relived that whole experience. And that's what he went through in the breath work. And then after that, he went back to his mother, and he basically recounted to her, and she basically validated the whole thing that had happened. Now, he had known that this had happened. It's not like he didn't have some awareness. He had known that had happened, but he didn't know any of the details. He remembered the exact building, the color of the building. He remembered the horror, the terror of it. He was born, actually, and his parents hid him for like 18 days before this happened because his mother was traumatized and she didn't want them to throw him off because many babies had died this way, as you can imagine. And so the mother was completely traumatized. So the baby was born at home and hidden in the closet, literally, for 18 days. And every day they would have this struggle. And she would say, the father would say, we have to go do this. And she'd say, but I can't throw my son off. But finally they did. And he did survive. And so that was really one of the most remarkable breathwork stories that I've ever heard.
Thank you so much. Yeah. People have to read it, you know.
Well, Jim, I just want to throw one question to Rupert, and that is, with this COVID-19 and the concept of morphic resonance, is there some correlation between the mutations that are taking place in the virus and your theory of morphic resonance?
Well, I don't think that the mutations pose any particular problem for regular science. I mean, they could just be random, as most scientists assume. And then you get a whole range of mutations, which in coronaviruses happen anyway. Colds are mutating the whole time, and it's a cold type virus. I think where morphic resonance might play a part is in the way in which people recover from it. If you're infected with it, you create an antibody response and you recover, as millions of people now have. By morphic resonance, it could make it easier for others to recover. And what the interesting thing that's happening, I follow it more in Britain, obviously, because I get more news here, but about a third of the people who are infected, according to tests, are asymptomatic now. I mean, they don't know they've got it. Our doctor was part of the Oxford AstraZeneca trial, and he had the injection, and they tested them, you know, because it's part of the experiment. And he told my wife a couple of days ago that 3 weeks after he'd had the injection, he was tested for the virus, and he'd got it, but it was asymptomatic, and it got into a discussion of asymptomatic. In that case, it's probably asymptomatic because of the injection, the vaccination. But there are many, many people who are getting it completely asymptomatically. And that's a puzzle for the medical world, but I think it could be a morphic resonance effect. Of course, we don't have any data on how many people were asymptomatic during the early phases of this pandemic. What we'd need is comparable data to see whether there's an increase in asymptomatic infections. But that's the kind of thing that I'd expect on the basis of morphic resonance. The only problem with the theory is that not all diseases die out. If morphic resonance enabled us to overcome all infectious diseases, then all plagues and pestilences would die out spontaneously. Some do and some don't. So there are obviously other factors at play. Anyway, that's the main area I haven't published this, of course, or because I don't have any evidence for it, and there's plenty of people speculating about COVID. I don't need to add to that cacophony, but since you asked me, that's my view and where I think it might show.
Thank you. And thank you, Will, for that beautiful story. I cut away so quickly. I apologize.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
There's so much richness here. So
I know this could go on forever, but I don't think we have the time.
If we have a little time, I wanted to ask Rupert for two things, yeah?
Yeah.
Two situations that I wanted to ask about. One was these homing pigeons. What do you think about it? You know, that's amazing thing. I think about after they expect, you know, only bit early experiments that nothing was really done, you know, materialistic. And then the last thing was this this movement in the track. I don't know, 200, 300 meters, you know, and they were rotating
in a truck.
So this was the one, and then the last one was when they actually took the house of the pigeons and took it into the ocean.
Yes.
So, you know, so
I can.
What do you think about it? This is amazing. I mean,
well, I've been interested in homing pigeons since I was a child. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I kept pigeons. And my father told me about homing, and my hometown in Nottinghamshire, Newark, is more or less in the centre of England with good railway connections. And every Saturday, there were all these wicker baskets full of pigeons from all over Britain for races. Racing pigeons, it's a sport in many parts of Europe. And so every Saturday morning, the porters at the railway station would open these baskets and release the pigeons, which would fly into the sky, circle around, and then head off to their homes. Some north to Scotland, some south to Kent or Cornwall, southwest. And you'd see them circle around and then go. I was totally fascinated. I was doing that from about the age of 5. And then I kept homing pigeons myself. And I tried my own experiments. I put them in a cardboard box and got on my bicycle, cycled 2 or 3 miles from home, released them, and then went home. And they were always there by the time I got back. They always beat me home. And when I was at Cambridge, I got back into this interest with homing pigeons. And I asked my colleagues who worked on birds what the explanation was. They just hadn't got one. They said, oh, it must be the sun's position, and then it wasn't that because they can do it at night. Then it must be magnetism. It wasn't that because they can do it when you strap magnets to them. And also that wouldn't explain homing because the magnet only tells you where north is, not where home is. So basically, nobody knew. And that's when I came up with the morphic field theory, that the pigeon is linked to its loft by an invisible field, like an invisible elastic band. And that's when I came up with this experiment, the reverse of the normal experiment. Instead of taking the pigeons from their home, you take the home from the pigeons. So I had these experiments I did first in Ireland on a friend's estate with mobile lofts. I had the loft on a trailer, and we pulled it with a tractor, varying distances. And we never got very far, though, in Ireland. This happened just before I took up my job in India. And then I did another experiment with a mobile loft in England, and then one in Holland. And in all these experiments, the pigeons found the loft when it had been moved 5 or 10 miles. They could have found it by random searching, but they wouldn't go into it because the terrain was so unfamiliar. That's what gave me the idea of an experiment on a ship at sea. And an opportunity arose because I was on a TV program in Holland where I talked about homing pigeons. I had a debate about them with Stephen Jay Gould and Daniel Dennett. And they were both saying, oh, it's all explained in normal terms. And I proved it wasn't. And then I said the ideal experiment would be on a ship at sea. And luckily, an admiral from the Royal Dutch Navy was watching the program and got interested. And a Dutch friend arranged with him to do this experiment on their main research vessel. So we had a pigeon loft with pigeons in it on the SF Tiedemann, which was the Dutch Navy's research vessel. They went from Holland to the Caribbean and back. And these pigeons, for 6,000 miles, were homing to a moving ship. And in one of the experiments, they took them off and took them 25 miles away on another ship while the ship kept moving, and they found it. And the most interesting observation was they were doing an experiment when they were near the island of Madeira, and one of the pigeons didn't come back. And they thought, well, probably it's just gone to the island of Madeira and sort of foraging there, or maybe it's met a mate. And the ship sailed on. 300 miles later, this pigeon rejoined the ship, and it had found its way to the ship from Madeira over a 300-mile distance. Now, this is all terribly interesting, of course, and it would be wonderful to do another experiment at sea, but it was very difficult to organize this experiment because, it's hard to persuade people. I suppose there could be billionaires with super yachts now who'd be up for this. But anyway, I was very lucky to have this preliminary and quite impressive research with the Royal Dutch Navy. And people in Holland were just totally fascinated by this because it's their national sport, racing pigeons. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to repeat the naval experiment so far, but this is unfinished business, and sooner or later, I dare say it will happen.
Thank you. It's amazing. Yeah. Can I quickly say another one, which is you were working with this psychic parrot in New York.
Yes.
What do you think about that? What was happening there?
Well, I was working with a psychic parrot called Enkisi. Its owner told me, she's an artist, and she told me that this bird picked up her thoughts, and she only had to think of something and it would say it. Like she'd think of, I've got to go and phone Bill. She went to her Rolodex to look up Bill's number, and the parrot would say, phone Bill. And the thing that struck me most about her stories about the parrot was that the parrot picked up what she was dreaming about. It sleeps in her bedroom. And she said she was frequently woken up from her dreams by the parrot speaking noisily about the things she was dreaming about. So I did these experiments with the parrot where we had a series of photographs corresponding to words it knew in sealed envelopes, 20 different stimuli. And then they were randomized, and we had the parrot filmed in one room. She was on a different floor of the house in another room. And she then opened a randomized envelope and looked at the picture, say it was a flower, and for 2 minutes. And then that was the end of the test. And then we analyzed the film of the parrot afterwards. We had it objectively evaluated by third parties who weren't part of the experiment. And it was amazing. The parrot, it worked incredibly well. When she was looking at a picture of the flower, the parrot said, that's a flower. It's a flower. Look at that pretty little flower. And then there was one of people hugging, and the parrot said, give me a hug. I want a hug. And it was just utterly amazing. And we published a paper on this in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. The results were overwhelmingly significant. And then I introduced her to Jane Goodall, and Jane used some of this footage on a TV show that she was putting out about animal intelligence. And Jane got on very well with Enkisi's owner because she thought that she was doing like field work in her living room, you know, a bit like Jane did it in Gombe in Tanzania. But what happened then was a disaster. The media found out about it. It was on the TV, and the day afterwards, her phone and mine rang off the hook. You know, I had people, I'm speaking to you from Hollywood. We want this parrot on a show. We want it to tell the fortune of celebrities, you know, right there on TV. We want to fly them out to New. And then, so she was inundated. I was inundated. And they found out where she lived. And she was worried about the parrot being stolen because people steal talking parrots. They're very valuable. And hers is the most celebrated talking parrot in the world. Now it has the all-time world record, 1,800 words. Alex, the one that Irene Pepperberg worked with that became quite famous as an example of non-human cognition, had a vocabulary of about 200 words. So anyway, she's still working with the parrot, but she asked me to take all this footage off. I've never shown it on the internet because she was so worried about the effect was traumatic. You know, when people with flash bulbs and a media feeding frenzy. And so she's still training it. And the parrot now speaks. Her main interest is language use. And the main thing she's working on at the moment is the way it constructs sentences. And it makes grammatical errors similar to those that children make. Instead of saying, he gave it to me, it said, he gived it to me. And so she's documenting all this and recording this. And so there's this archive of unbelievably interesting stuff, still unpublished, that she's still working on. I hope that she'll get a grant and be able to write this up, because it's never before has anyone done such interesting research with a parrot. For her, the telepathic side of it was like a byproduct of her main project. And for me, it was the most astonishing example I've come across of animal telepathy. When I did tests myself, when I first met her, I did a test there and then. We went into a different room and I asked her if she got any cards or pictures, and she got out a tarot pack. And I shuffled through it and picked a picture. It was a picture of a girl, a young woman. And I said, just please look at that. And I didn't say anything more than look at that. And then the parrot from the next room, after a few seconds, said, it's a girl. So that's what made me think it was worth doing this experiment. And the experiment was just astonishing. And I only wish there hadn't been this media feeding frenzy, because it made her very paranoid about doing more research of this kind. And so now she's gone back to her main project of language use.
Well, thank you
so
Rupert.
much. It's great.
Thank you, Stan and
Wonderful,
Will.
yeah.
Great story.
And I just want to say, since we're on this subject, I had the privilege of meeting Amy through Rupert, actually. And I can testify to the psychic power of the parrot. I was about 40 minutes late to the appointment. Amy had some surgery, so I wanted to stop and get flowers. And I thought in the taxi that I would pass a florist shop. So I kept looking all along the way, but I didn't find anything. But I thought, since I was so late and I didn't know the neighborhood in which she was living, I would just go and be as on time as I could. As soon as I was welcome inside the door, the parrot flew at me and said, "Where are the flowers?" Where are the flowers? And because I hadn't brought the flowers, he began to dive bomb me. And Amy had to say, now in Kesey, it's okay, it's okay. So that's an example of not only the parrot's capacity with someone he knew, but someone he had never met, except through access into her psyche somehow, that a guest was coming. So he was beaming in on me in a way that was incontrovertible. And this is just, another indicator that the world is a single information sharing, intelligent system in which all of us find our part, whether it's a homing pigeon or a mystic or a African gray parrot. So I want to thank you for a very stimulating discussion today, Rupert and Will. We'll be doing it again next month with a different cast of characters on a different aspect of Stan's life. But I'd like to draw this to a close by asking Susan to tell us more about the film that's going to be premiered tomorrow, so that all of us that are watching this program can tune in and see a more comprehensive treatment of Stan's life and journey. Susan?
Thanks, Jim. So the documentary covers Stan's life, really the full scope of his insights, how he developed those insights, his process. And so you get a deep understanding of the coax system, of perinatal matrices, his early work with psychedelics, how he started, as he called it, a freshly baked psychiatrist, inducing insulin comas and electroshock therapies, and being so disheartened with his work until he had his first LSD experience. And it goes on, and through the course of the film, you're introduced to each of these subjects with a wonderful array of experts. Of course, Rupert and Will are part of those experts. They make up, they offer additional information. Rupert shares his field theory of the mind, which is quite amazing. And it really is an introduction to not just Stan's work, but many of the theories and ideas that were introduced during his 14 years as the Esalen scholar in residence. And so it really is a opening into an invitation rather to begin your own process of inner exploration in this moment of transformation for the entire planet. And it's an offering that I make, and I'm so grateful for Stan and Brigitte and their support of me and their interactions with me, because they're co-producers. Stan verified the content, as did Brigitte. And so it's through the film, through the website. Tomorrow is the streaming of the documentary, a chance to watch it. Later, a conversation with Rick Doblin and Dennis McKenna about their own process of evolution through their work with psychedelics. And I think the theme of tomorrow's conversation is also the importance of, as Rupert said, really treating psychedelics as a rite of passage, and not, as Will said, some party drug. That it really is an opportunity to open into these deep truths, to this collective consciousness, and an opportunity to evolve, because we're being asked to. And so how do we meet this moment? This is a way of doing it. And then on our website, thewayofthepsychonaut.com, you have access to our summer streaming series. And Rupert joined us for one of those. And we have the Q&A that followed. So anyway, all that information is on the website. I think the link is being offered through the chat to this streaming tomorrow. And if you can't join us live, it's at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Pacific time. You can pre-order a recording. We think the price is reasonable, $12, $10 for a pre-recording of a pre-order of the recording of our conversation. So I'll leave it at that, Jim. Thank you so much for mentioning it. And thank you to Will and to Rupert.
Thank you so much
For joining us today.
Thank you.
What a joy
thank
it's
you.
been. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think I'll go out and buy a parrot now.
Well, you got to make sure you get the right one.
That's right. That's right.
And there's a whole story of Amy tells about how she met in Kinsey at the pet store.
Oh, wow.
And he marched right up and identified himself, knowing that she was going to choose a parrot, that he was the guy.
Wow.
So,
Okay. Well, I'll go in with a very receptive attitude.
well, what a marvelous, marvelous conversation. And just in closing, I want to welcome everybody to our after session chat group. You'll see the link to that for anyone who wants to continue this dialogue. And then I want to highlight that on the 2nd of March, in about 3 weeks' time, we're going to have a whole live workshop with Rupert, just to go more deeply into his research and pioneering efforts at the frontiers of true science. And that's so important to this point of what constitutes science. We're in the grip of a world where science is imprisoned by obsolete assumptions. And what we've seen on the show today with Stan, Brigitte, Rupert, and Will are true scientists who approach data in a spirit of inquiry, in the spirit of truth pursued rather than truth possessed. So I just want to salute some of the great scientists of our time who have joined us on Humanity Rising today. Also want to note Valentine is coming up on Sunday. This is a good time to express your love for everyone. And then on Monday, we're going to have a woman who's been working in this field for many, many years, Anne-Marie Concalves-Desai in Brussels, doing a special session on the alchemy of right relationship. So that'll be our Valentine's gift to everyone on Monday. So thank you, everyone. This has been a beautiful, beautiful session. And we'll come back on the 12th of March for another installment in our celebration, Stan, of your generous genius over decades as we've all grown and explored the deeper meaning of this world. And Susan,
thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Monday. Bye-bye. Great session.
Thank you.